Welcome to our first lecture of week 7 of the spring 2021 semester. We will continue our look at American foreign policy and America abroad during the 1890s through the first 2 decades of the 20th century today. We'll take a look at the Philippine-American War and then examine American foreign policy in general and anti-imperialism and imperialism in particular under President Theodore Roosevelt's administration. So, in our last discussion, we covered the Spanish-American War, the reasons why America went to war, the yellow journalism tactics of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers in New York at the time, the explosion on the USS Maine in Havana Harbor that was thought to be an act of war, at least by the American public, in large part because those newspapers sensationalized the story, and presented it as an act of war, but in reality it was just an unfortunate accident, as a comprehensive investigation uncovered 8 decades later in the 1970s. But that was the Spanish-American War, and that was America's first real dip into imperialism, if you will. They defeated Spain and sort of became a superpower with the defeat of the Spanish naval fleet, but they also gained foreign territories: Cuba, the Philippine Islands, Puerto Rico, and Guam. They fought that war in part under the guise of helping Cuba get independence from Spain. But of course, as we'll discuss today, the U.S. sort of oversaw Cuban independence and sort of held Cuba as a protectorate, which was not quite a colony, but not quite an independent nation as well for a few years. They wouldn't let Cuba get independence on their own terms. It had to be amenable to the U.S. as well. And that was America's first acquisition of foreign colonies, following in the footsteps of what Great Britain and France and Germany and Spain and other European nations had been practicing for years and years, decades and decades. The U.S. doesn't get involved until after the 1898 Spanish-American War. We also discussed the annexation of Hawaii in 1898 in our most recent discussion. We'll go over that briefly again, or revisit that, I should say, later in our discussion today. But I want to talk about what happens after the Spanish-American War, and that is the Philippine-American War. It took place from 1899 through 1902, and as I mentioned, when Congress ratified the Treaty of Paris in the spring of 1899, America officially acquired the Philippine Islands from Spain in exchange for $20 million. Yet, the residents of the Philippine Islands, Filipinos, if you will, were not happy about this development, as they, like their counterparts in Cuba, had sought independence from Spain for many years. And now, instead of being under the thumb of the Spanish government, they were under the thumb of the United States government, if you will. And they were not independent. They didn't like this, and as a result, there was a conflict that lasted the better part of 3 years, from 1899 to 1902. It was tactically a guerrilla war in which the normal rules of warfare were not followed. It was insurgent Filipino forces attacking the U.S. Whenever they had the opportunity to. It wasn't like your classic pitched battles like you saw so often in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and in particular with the Civil War. There were no rules, if you will. There were no rules of warfare in a guerrilla war, and certainly not in this guerrilla war after McKinley refused to grant independence to the Philippines in 1899. What were the costs of the war? Well, simply put, America sent over 126,000 troops to the Philippines throughout the duration of the war, and more than 4,200 American troops were killed in combat, a significantly higher number of combat-related deaths for the U.S. than they had incurred in the Spanish-American War. If you recall from our most recent discussion, there was over 5,500 casualties on the American side in the Spanish-American War, but most of those were due to diseases and illnesses that the American troops contracted in the tropical climate as American troops died of yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and dysentery, all contributed significantly to the casualty count for the U.S. in the Spanish-American War. Fewer than 400 American soldiers actually died in combat in the Spanish-American War. More than 4,200 were killed in combat in the Philippine-American War. And of course, the Spanish-American War lasted just over 4 months, basically the spring and the summer months of 1898, while the Philippine-American War was about a 2.5 to 3 year affair. I mentioned the guerrilla warfare tactics that were practiced on both sides really in that war, and one example of that on the American side was this was a war in which American soldiers practiced torture on their Filipino prisoners of war, including what we would refer to as water torture. These were tactics that were endorsed by Theodore Roosevelt, who by 1901 had become president of the United States. Roosevelt believed that it was acceptable to inflict what he termed dark abuses on Filipino prisoners as the price necessary to pay for the progress of humanity. Again, that was how Roosevelt framed it, the progress of humanity. Even after American troops captured the Philippine leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, in 1901, the conflict continued until the middle of the following year, 1902, before it ended. And if you take a look at the image, the political cartoon in the upper right-hand corner here, it shows Uncle Sam holding a pair of clippers, scissors as a barber. He has an open chair, and I don't know that if you can read that, his scissors, but it says education and civilization on the actual blades of the scissors, and he's turning around and looking in the direction of the gentleman sitting in the chair over there, who is supposed to represent a Filipino in the traditional attire and grooming of Filipinos at that time. And Uncle Sam is basically saying, "You're next," as in the Filipino is the next person for the chair to get the haircut and his grooming replaced, and sort of alluding to the fact that, as we discussed with earlier this semester with Native American culture and the white settlers in the U.S. government trying to break down Native American culture in the 1870s and 1880s, that part of the reason, the methods that they used to do that was to send Native American children to boarding schools where they were where they received haircuts and were required to wear clothes that were customary attire for white American children as opposed to Native American regalia, and they were forbidden to speak anything but English language-wise in those schools. And that's sort of what this cartoon is depicting, that Uncle Sam is looking menacingly over at the Filipino in the chair, basically saying, "It's your turn. I'm going to use these scissors with education and civility, or education and civilization as the representation for these scissors, but I'm going to essentially turn you into a civilized human and not a savage," which is the way that most white Americans viewed non-white culture, whether that was in the U.S., but especially in Latin America at this time. So an interesting political cartoon there that I think really gives you a clear and perceptive look at the perspective of both America and the Filipinos. As you can see, the look on the face of the Filipino, he is not happy. He's got sort of a sneer on his face, is not happy about this at all. So a very accurate portrayal of the mood and the tension that existed between America and the territory of the Philippine Islands during the period of the Philippine-American War in the early 1900s. So let's take a look at American foreign policy under President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. I've mentioned this in previous discussions. It bears repeating again, though. Roosevelt was on the Republican presidential ticket in the election of 1900. He was actually the vice presidential candidate as William McKinley was running for re-election, the Republican that had defeated William Jennings Bryan in 1896. He was running for a second term as president. Roosevelt was now on the ticket as his vice presidential nominee, his running mate, if you will. And once again, McKinley was running against William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic nominee in 1900, just as he had been in 1896. McKinley wins the election and is inaugurated for a second term. Roosevelt is inaugurated as the vice president. And then about 6 months, 8 months or so after the inauguration, McKinley is assassinated in Buffalo, New York. He died about a week after he was shot, and Theodore Roosevelt ascends to the presidency. What does this mean as far as American foreign policy? Well, simply put, Roosevelt seeks to extend and perhaps build on the pro-imperialism views, pro-expansion views of William McKinley. Like McKinley, Roosevelt supported the 1898 annexation of Hawaii, and like McKinley, he opposed Philippine independence in 1899 and 1900 and was committed to continuing American involvement in the Philippine-American War for as long as it took to resolve that conflict when he took over as president. So, McKinley was an imperialist and believed that America needed to expand and become an empire. Roosevelt agreed and continued on with some of McKinley's broader foreign policy viewpoints. But it's important to note that not everybody in America during this time was on board with imperialism. There was an anti-imperialism movement, and in fact, an anti-imperialist league that featured a number of prominent Americans of the period who either were officially members of the Anti-Imperialist League, or in general broadly supported anti-imperialism or opposed imperialism, if you will. Some of the prominent Americans who opposed imperialism included Jane Addams. We talked about her earlier this semester. She was founded Hull House in Chicago, the settlement house, kind of an early social worker and activist for the women's movement in America, and specifically in Chicago, but all over America. Mark Twain, of course, you've probably heard of Mark Twain, one of the most popular, successful, and prominent authors of the era of the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. He vehemently opposed imperialism. Ida Wells Barnett, who you read her essay in your primary source analysis assignment, you know that she was anti-lynching. She was also opposed to imperialism. And Samuel Gompers, a name that we haven't really discussed this semester, but he was the key leader of the labor movement at this time. He was the president of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, from the late 19th century all the way up until the 1920s. So he was arguably the most prominent and influential labor leader of the era. All of these people opposed American imperialism. Andrew Carnegie, the steel baron, or the steel magnate and robber baron, I should say, also publicly opposed imperialism, and he actually contributed funds to the Anti-Imperialist League. But as you can imagine, with such a broad cross-section of individuals opposing imperialism during this time, there were various reasons. They had different reasons for why they opposed imperialism, but the common thread was that they did oppose imperialism. Progressives such as Jane Addams and Ida Wells Barnett, and to a degree, I guess, Samuel Gompers, they believed that residents of the foreign territories that America was looking to colonize and take over should have the right to self-govern without American interference. That the people that lived over there were capable of forming their own governments and running their country as they see fit, or as they saw fit, and they didn't need American supervision, American interference. The labor movement, which Samuel Gompers obviously represented and advocated for, in general, the labor movement in America during this time opposed imperialism primarily out of fear that it would result in increased competition for jobs. This is similar to the labor movement's opposition to Chinese immigration on the West Coast, Chinese immigrants in the 1880s. We talked about that with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that they were particularly fearful of Chinese immigrants who wanted to take manual labor jobs, because that would take away opportunities from white Americans on the West Coast. And that same type of sentiment, same type of ideology existed with the labor movement's opposition to imperialism. They're afraid that imperialism would result in residents from these foreign territories coming over to America at some point and trying to find work and make a living in America, and that would take away potential job opportunities for the white American laborers that were part of the American Federation of Labor at that time. Other anti-imperialists viewed imperialism as an avenue for an America to become more diverse racially and ethnically, which would pose a threat to the existing social hierarchy with white Americans at the top. So in other words, I think we've pretty well established up to this point in this semester that there was a clear political and social hierarchy in America during the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, in which white Americans, and particularly white American men, were at the top of the social hierarchy. They were really the only people that could vote in the first decade of the 20th century, as women didn't have the right to vote yet, and the Jim Crow laws throughout the South had stripped African American men of their opportunities to vote or to vote in large numbers. And at this period in time, the South was the region with by far the largest African American population in the country. So they viewed imperialism as a situation in which non-white individuals from these foreign territories that America was colonizing would eventually come over here, and by virtue of their presence, if they settled down and put roots in America and raised their families in America, that would make America less white and more diverse, and that would challenge the lofty position of white Americans at the top of the social hierarchy. It's important to note that some of the politicians, a lot of the key politicians of this time, beyond President McKinley and his successor, Theodore Roosevelt, but a lot of the significant senators and congressmen of this era were pro-imperialist, not only for business reasons, but also because they believed that it was America's duty to spread Christianity to these territories that were acquired and were colonized by America. This idea, again, like that political cartoon suggested, that these people living in the colonized territories like the Philippines, like Puerto Rico and Guam and Cuba, were unsophisticated and incapable of living a civilized existence, and were savages and barbaric and things like that, and they needed a white Christianity. So that was many white Christian Protestants of this era, the leaders sought to go to these new colonies as missionaries and spread the word of Christianity, and a lot of these politicians supported it as well, and even couched America's opportunity to acquire these territories through colonization as sort of part of God's will, that America would expand and become an empire to rival those of the Western European nations. That, much like the Manifest Destiny argument from the early portion of the 19th century, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, in which they viewed it as the politicians and business leaders of that era viewed westward expansion as the natural progression for America, and that it was preordained that America would be one large country that would run coast to coast across the length of the continent, that same sort of thought process was applied by this subsequent generation of political and religious leaders, that it was America's Christian duty and God's personal desire for America to take over these foreign territories and spread Christianity, convert these native residents of these colonized lands into Christians, and civilize them and show them how a civilized Christian is supposed to live. So there's a lot of competing and conflicting political and social viewpoints on the pro-imperialism side versus the anti-imperialism side, and that's just sort of a snapshot. Once you get beyond, the official policy of President Theodore Roosevelt, as well as his predecessor, William McKinley. If you take a look at the image in the upper right-hand corner, these were some of the prominent anti-imperialists of the era. In the the top right-hand corner of the image, you see Mark Twain, and I believe next to him, the top middle or middle top, I believe that's William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic presidential candidate in 1900, who also opposed imperialism for America at this time. And in fact, Bryan ran on an anti-imperialist platform in the 1900 election, while McKinley ran on a pro-imperialism, pro-expansion platform. So now let's take a look more in depth at the foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt during this time period. I mentioned that he more or less echoed the thoughts of McKinley with regard to expansion and imperialism. But let's take a look at why he was pro-imperialist. First and foremost, I think we can just boil it down to quite simply, his pro-imperialism position was a byproduct of his view that America should always protect its interests, its economic interests, its military interests, and he believed that imperialism was a method to do that would be effective presently and over the long haul. If America could get these territories, it would benefit them economically, and as far as their military was concerned, give them a military advantage as well. I mentioned earlier he supported the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, in large part because he felt that Pearl Harbor was an advantageous port for American naval ships to refuel and to be stationed as well. It was strategically located in between the west coast of America, California, and the Pacific Northwest, and the Pacific Rim of Asia, China, Japan, and other countries in the Far East or the Pacific Rim. Hawaii is sort of in between America's west coast and the Pacific Rim Asian nations, and economically, it would help merchants to be able to stop in at Pearl Harbor to port and refuel on their way to importing and exporting products out of Asia. And as far as the military goes, it would be advantageous to protect America's coastline from Japan and China and countries of that ilk at this time. Like McKinley, Roosevelt believed that if America failed to annex Hawaii, that there was a strong likelihood that Japan would colonize the Hawaiian Islands, and they would be able to station their warships in Pearl Harbor and block America from access to Pearl Harbor, and that they would have a strategic position to potentially attack America down the road, just going from Hawaii to America's west coast. As always, economic interests were also part of it. I mentioned the ships importing and exporting goods to and from Asia. Also, the economic interests of the American sugar barons were something that Roosevelt was certainly okay with protecting, much like William McKinley was. Let's move on from Hawaii now and specifically discuss Latin America and the Caribbean. We've talked quite a bit about the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War in the last couple of lectures, including today's lecture. After these two wars ended, first of all, before we get to that point, it's important to note that Roosevelt supported both the Spanish-American War, as he was the Assistant Secretary of Navy of the U.S. Navy at the time, and led a volunteer unit, the Rough Riders, in combat in the Spanish-American War, but he was very much pro-war for the Spanish-American War, and also for the Philippine-American War. He was vice president when that Philippine-American War took place, although it actually had broken out before he was on the ticket, but it was ongoing while he was a running mate and also as vice president before he became president. And of course, he oversaw the final year and a half or so of American involvement in the Philippine-American War. After those two wars were over, Roosevelt sought to expand America's control over Latin America and the Caribbean Sea. He did this by dispatching the U.S. Navy to force Colombia to grant independence to Panama. Panama was a colony of Colombia at the time, and the U.S. Navy forced Colombia to give independence to Panama, and as a thank you for that, the government that took over in Panama provided access to a canal zone to the U.S. That ultimately became the Panama Canal, which the U.S. had control over for many, many years, and it was a very vital transportation route for ships and for the American economy in terms of, again, importing and exporting goods during the early decades of the 20th century. Roosevelt's foreign policy is perhaps best summed up by the Roosevelt Corollary, which he introduced in a 1904 speech to the U.S. Congress, both houses of Congress. He was addressing at once, and he brings up what he called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was an American foreign policy procedure that had been an American foreign policy, I should say, that had been enacted during the presidency of James Monroe in the early decades of the 19th century that more or less blocked European intervention into Latin America. Roosevelt, with his corollary, basically said that since the Monroe Doctrine blocked European intervention into Latin America, that the U.S. could fill that void and intervene through either diplomacy or force in the region whenever necessary. Roosevelt specifically proclaimed that America was free to exercise what he called an international police power in the region, since it was located within what he called America's sphere of influence. And that's a pretty important phrase right there, sphere of influence. That's basically how you can sum up Roosevelt's views on the annexation of Hawaii and of the acquisition of the Philippines islands and refusing to grant Philippine independence. He believed that all of that was geographically within the sphere of influence of America, as they were American territories, and America, in his view, should be able to basically go in there and protect its interests, either through military force if necessary, but preferably for diplomacy. He did not necessarily want to go around starting wars on whims or for for petty reasons, but he was certainly willing to use America's military might as a threat to get what America needed to, as sort of a last resort option. America would use this international police power that Roosevelt claimed they had in the Roosevelt Corollary repeatedly in Latin America during this time. In 1905, they used it in the Dominican Republic to oversee and force the Dominican Republic to pay foreign debts to the U.S. that they owed. He also sent the military to Cuba, which was still in the process of becoming independent. It was an American protectorate, and as a result of this sort of sphere of influence, international police power, America acquired Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which still is American territory as a naval base in Cuba. The Roosevelt Corollary in particular, and Roosevelt's foreign policy in general, was viewed or is known as sort of as big stick diplomacy. As that was Roosevelt's term. He said America should speak softly but carry a big stick, the big stick of military might to wield if necessary. Other folks referred to it as gunboat diplomacy. But whatever you called it, whether it was big stick diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy, or and some people called it dollar diplomacy, whichever term you prefer, the end result is that it was a major expansion of American military power abroad. Prior to Roosevelt becoming president and outlining his foreign policies and setting out to enact these foreign policies, America was not a military superpower, and it was not really interested in the affairs beyond its own shores unless it was absolutely necessary. But with the Spanish-American War, America defeated Spain, which had been and still was at the time in 1898 a technical superpower, even though the Spanish Navy wasn't as powerful as it had been in previous centuries. It was still considered a global superpower. So by beating Spain in 1898, America earned the distinction of becoming a military superpower, and Roosevelt's foreign policies more or less solidified America's superpower status. If you will, he flexed America's military might to demonstrate to the rest of Western Europe and the superpowers of the world that America was not to be trifled with in the issues of foreign policy. But if you think about it, in recent decades, America has, has been criticized by other nations, and also there's been debate within America about this idea that America is always trying to serve as the world's policeman and always sort of trying to flex its muscles militarily around the world in sometimes when it has no business in doing that. That's something that we sort of live with today and have lived with for decades, But it wasn't necessarily the case in 1896, 1897, and in 1898 before the Spanish-American War, and even after the Spanish-American War, it didn't really become solidified and a major part of federal policy and until the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909. So it's a major change in the way that America responds to foreign affairs and the way that America uses its military. And as we've discussed today, that there was certainly some positives to that economically and perhaps even strategically from a military standpoint, but there were a lot of questions about whether or not this was the right thing for America to do. Would the founders of America, did they, establish the country to one day be an empire, since they themselves had broken off and sought independence from the British Empire? Did they really want that for America going forward? Well, in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt decided that whether the founders wanted that or not, that was a political and military necessity for America, an economic necessity as well. So that will wrap up today's lecture, and I will talk to you again on Thursday.